Hi, everybody. This is Liz Stanton from Synapse, and we are ready to get going on our presentation for the day. We're going to be talking about Synapse's new multi-sector toolkit and presenting a case study to you about our recent reports on deep emission cuts in the RGGI region. I have with me here Pat Knight, one of our analysts and key author on our RGGI work and designer of some of our new tools. We'll be talking to you about those things. I'm going to be moderating the discussion, and I'll start out by telling you how this all works. So if you haven't been on one of our webinars before, here's how we do it. Everybody out there is muted except for us, the presenters. And we do want to hear your questions, but the way to get those to us is through email. So if you have a substantive question, something you'd like answered, or have the presenters here, then please send that to me using the webinar at synapse-energy.com email address. And I'll be monitoring that email account throughout the webinar. And when you send questions to me, then I'm going to wait for a good moment and pass them along to Pat. That might be at the end of his presentation, or I might interrupt him in the middle. If you instead have a technical problem of any kind, please use the chat function of the WebEx software that you have in front of you. So use chat for technical problems and use webinar at synapse-energy.com for any other kinds of questions. After the webinar is over, we'll be sending out the slides and a recording of the webinar to everybody that's participating today, and those will also be up on our website. And in fact, I think the slides are already up on our website, if that's helpful to you. Most of you will know Synapse already. We're based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it might finally be spring out today. And we are a consulting firm. We specialize in a lot of different energy topics, many of which are touching on our electricity system, but as our presentation today will show, more and more having a good understanding and ability to model and analyze the connections between the different energy sectors has become increasingly important. So that's what we do. Our clients are primarily advocates. They're environmental advocates or consumer advocates, and also government agencies. We'll be talking, as I said, first a bit about the RGGI opportunity papers that came out in January and February, and then going on to look a little more at the methodology and the tools that we have available. I'm going to turn it all over now to Pat Knight to give you the presentation. Pat?
Great. Thanks for that, Liz. So as Liz was saying, today we'll be talking about two different but related topics. First, I'll be talking about our recent RGGI opportunity paper. I'll first talk a little bit about the study findings, and then I'll dive into the methodology on how we actually did the analysis. After that, I'll be talking about the Synapse multi-sector toolkit. This is an interesting project to talk about within the context of our toolkit because just so many of the tools that we use here at Synapse we actually applied in this one specific project. So this is a good opportunity to learn about how all those tools can fit together and about how you might find them useful for your own projects or analysis. So first, let's talk about the RGGI opportunity. So some of you out there might be wondering what exactly is RGGI. If you're not familiar with it, RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it's a program aimed at reducing CO2 emissions in the electric sector through the use of a cap-and-trade mechanism. 9 states in the Northeast are part of RGGI. They're the 6 New England states, plus New York, Maryland, and Delaware. Since RGGI was started in 2009, many of the Northeast states have made substantial progress in reducing emissions, and as of recently, they've achieved emission reduction levels roughly about 45% below the 1990 levels, which is a common benchmark for these states. Most of the RGGI states have complementary policies in addition to RGGI that are aimed at reducing CO2 emissions. And these policies can include energy efficiency standards as well as renewable portfolio standards. All of these states are also subject to the Clean Power Plan. There's a bit of uncertainty out there about the Clean Power Plan these days because of the recent U.S. Supreme Court stay on the rule, but I'll mention it here briefly just to say that the cap, the mass-based cap in the Clean Power Plan is roughly equivalent to the RGGI cap. It's a little bit less stringent, but it's very close. So you've got RGGI, you've got the Clean Power Plan, you've got the energy efficiency standards, you've got renewable portfolio standards, but almost every single one of the RGGI states also has legislation aimed at reducing all sector emissions by certain dates in the future. And you can see a table of this over here on the right. I say almost all states because Delaware is the one exception with a goal instead of a legislated mandatory target. All these states have a little bit different goals in terms of how they're framed or when they go into action, but you can think of them all as roughly equivalent to 40% emission reductions compared to 1990 levels by the year 2030, and about 80% emission reduction levels compared to 1990 levels by the year 2050. And what's interesting about these goals and kind of the foundation of the entire RGGI Opportunity Project is that we found that even with RGGI, the energy efficiency standards, renewable portfolio standards, and other policies, these states are still a long ways away from meeting their mandatory or sort of targets for emission reductions by the year 2030. And that if these states wish to still achieve these goals by the year 2030, then they will have to take more action. So how do we get to there from here? This is a chart showing historical and projected emissions from all sectors from all 9 RGGI states. So the sectors we're looking at here are the electric sector, the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, as well as the transportation sector. The sort of flat line at the top of the chart indicates the level of emissions that were present in 1990, whereas the shaded area indicates how emissions have changed with respect to that flat level over time. You'll see that in the mid-2000s, emissions have raised a bit, but ever since they've been declining. Over here on the right side of the chart, we're in the area of projected emissions and looking forward at where these emission reductions are going to end up in the future. So this baseline case, which I'll be talking a lot more about in just a second, takes together RGGI as it exists right now, takes together the existing policies for renewables and energy efficiency, and forecasts out what the level of emissions are going to be in the year 2030, and you can compare that against the 40% below 1990 level, illustrated here with the black line, and there's still a significant amount of emissions above and beyond that. So what we had to do in this project was take a look at a number of shifts. Now, when we're saying shifts, we're looking at 6 different big-ticket items, and these items were used, or these items or strategies were used in order to achieve emission reductions across a wide number of different sectors. The shifts that we looked at in this project include EVs, or vehicle electrification, heat pumps, so switching oil use at residences over to electric heat pumps, electric energy efficiency, gas energy efficiency, and expansion of wind and solar on the utility side. Now, I'll talk about each one of these in just a second, but first, let's skip to the findings of the study. What we found in the study is that the 6 shifts imply that getting to 40% emission reductions requires action in multiple sectors. However, that action doesn't have to be expensive. We found that these emission reduction measures actually save money for customers, whether it's through the use of adoption of electric vehicles, by converting aging oil heaters to more efficient heat pumps, by modernizing outdated gas furnaces and putting in things like better household insulation, by implementing other types of electric side energy efficiency, and by replacing utility-scale fossil generation with onshore wind and large solar. By implementing all these measures, we see that while overall electric sales fall, despite an increase of required sales from heat pumps and electric vehicles, and I can talk about that in just a minute. We also see that in a policy scenario that does achieve 40% CO2 emission reductions, that renewables supply 1/2 of the RGGI region's electric generation in the year 2030. All these renewables and energy efficiency translate into significant job savings, into significant job growth, rather. And we're seeing, over the course of the study period, job additions of about 60,000 jobs in the RGGI region per year from these new policies. Overall, these policies result in about $26 billion in net present value terms, even when not including the social cost of carbon.
Pat, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. Thanks for giving us those key findings, and I know you're going to go into some more detail about the studies. We actually had quite a few people join us from the point where I had let people know how the webinar operates, and I want to just catch them up with how to ask questions and so forth. So this is Liz Stanton. I am moderating today's webinar, and I just wanted you all to know that if you have a question that you'd like me to ask of Pat about the RGGI reports that we've written and about the methodologies and tools that we're using here at Synapse, you should go ahead and email that to me at webinar@synapse-energy.com. And if you're having any technical problems, you can go ahead and use the chat function in WebEx. But for other kinds of questions, please use that email. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And yeah, please let me know if people are asking questions as we go. So that was a bit about the key findings. Let's get into the methodology. So in the first step, we developed a baseline scenario. And this is really important for comparative purposes. We want to compare our future, where we're looking at significant emission reductions, against another future in a case where we do nothing at all. So this is a bar chart showing emissions by sector throughout a couple of different years in the baseline scenario. For the first bar, we've got the emissions in 1990. Next up is the emissions in the year 2013. And what you can see here is that between 1990 and 2013, emissions from all the sectors decreased by 20%. Earlier on, I gave a figure of 45%. So that 45% emission reductions comes from the electric sector only. You can see that this large orange area shrinks by almost half down to its level in 2013. Next up is the bar that we modeled in our baseline scenario for the year 2030. By implementing policies that are currently in place, like RGGI as is, like energy efficiency standards and renewable portfolio standards that exist today, we're forecasting that the RGGI states can achieve emission reduction levels of 23% by 2030. So still significant, but still a long ways to go before you get the 40% that these states' legislation requires. So with that 23% in hand, we can walk over to this chart here and figure out what the emission reduction target has to be. So you've got your baseline level of emission reductions. What's the level of emission reductions that's required for new policies to get you to 40%? And the way the math works out, that basically equals 86 million short tons. So in our third step, we create a marginal abatement cost curve. And this is a pretty interesting exercise. So what we're doing in this part of the analysis is going out and researching a number of what I refer to as big ticket items. These are strategies that we know exist today with today's technology. These are strategies that we know can achieve significant emission reductions and also have also come at a price that is reasonable when compared to the cost of business as usual strategies.
Pat, you'd mentioned the social cost of carbon before. I know some of our listeners are going to want to know whether or not the social cost of carbon is in the marginal abatement cost curve.
Sure, that's a great question, and that actually feeds right into what I'm about to talk next. So each one of these blocks here indicate a different strategy or shift that we looked at. And along the x-axis, you can see what the emission reduction potential is for each one of these shifts. On the y-axis is the annual cost, and that annual cost includes the levelized cost of actually building the strategy, but also includes things like avoided costs. So avoided costs of carbon, that's part of what's baked into these costs, as well as avoided costs of generation and capacity from traditional resources. For a couple of these resources, these costs also include the cost of building clean energy. So for electric vehicles and heat pumps, we're looking at transferring a lot of energy from the non-electric sectors over to the electric sector. And to be sure that these new sales from these measures don't result in increased emissions, we're saying that for every electric vehicle and every heat pump you add a commensurate amount of clean energy. So the cost of adding in incremental utility PV or incremental onshore wind is actually also baked into the cost of the electric vehicles and the heat pumps.
So I think that's a tricky bit. So just to be really clear, for, say, one of the measures here, let's say electric vehicles, you are transferring away from using gasoline to power those vehicles. Instead, you're going to need megawatt hours. And for every, so you get the savings of not using the gasoline. You have to change from one kind of vehicle to another, but now you're using these megawatt hours. You're not just purchasing them off of the existing grid. You're actually investing in enough renewables to make sure that that additional use of energy is covered?
That's correct. So it's essentially saying for electric vehicles, there's an incremental cost associated with making sure that the electrons that power those cars are coming from clean energy. So we take each one of these resources and stack them up in order from lowest cost to highest cost. And then we walk down the list and pick enough resources until we get to the level of 86 million short tons. The requirement, or the additional requirement that gets us to a level of 40% emission reductions. So I figure people will find this pretty interesting, so I'll spend a little bit of time and talk about each one of the 6 different shifts we look at. The first shift is about vehicle electrification, and in this shift we're looking at transferring 35% of the existing light-duty vehicle trips under 100 miles to trips taken with plug-in battery electric vehicles by the year 2030. So basically, 1/3 of normal commuting trips and normal cars are replaced with electric vehicles by the year 2030. For heat pumps, we're looking at, by the year 2030, about half of the residential consumption of petroleum being replaced with these ductless mini-split heat pump systems. For electric energy efficiency, we're saying that by the year, I think it's 2029 in this analysis, or 2025, I can't remember exactly which, we're ramping up to the level of energy efficiency savings that we're currently seeing in Massachusetts out into the future. All the RGGI states are currently making very good headway in terms of electric energy efficiency, but there's a couple of states out there that can still do quite a bit more above and beyond what's going on in the baseline. For gas energy efficiency, we based our projections on a potential study in a 2013 LBNL report, which is roughly about 2% annual incremental each year through the year 2030. For onshore wind and utility PV, we looked at a 2015 NREL study that looked at the economically available potential for these 2 resources in the Northeast and in each one of the RGGI states.
Let me just interrupt with a question that came in from the audience. What was assumed here about the offshore wind?
So offshore wind is one of these strategies that we could have included, but we didn't. So this marginal abatement cost curve includes 6 resources. There's a whole host of other resources out there that we could have looked at, but we didn't include. So things like distributed PV, things like offshore wind rather, things like switching longer trips from cars to electric trains or things like that are all strategies that you could do in some other analysis. We just didn't do here.
We're picking a small set and focusing in on the potential there, but there are other things that are possible too.
That's absolutely right. So in step 4, we take what we learned from the marginal abatement cost curve and apply it to our electric sector model known as READS. In READS, we give it inputs for things that we've learned from the marginal abatement cost curve analysis. So we tell it to build the amount of energy efficiency that has cleared the curve. We tell it to build an incremental amount of solar and wind to commensurate with what's cleared the curve. All those go in, READS does its calculation, and gives us outputs about generation, emissions, and costs. We then take that information and put it into our M-SEM tool, which looks at the non-electric side of emission reductions. This chart displays how the emissions outputs line up from those series of models. So kind of like the bar chart we were looking at just a couple minutes ago, we've got historical emissions for 1990 and 2015, and forward-looking emissions for 2020, 2025, and 2030 for both the baseline and the policy scenarios. And it's only in the 2030 policy scenario that we're finally achieving those levels of 40% emission reductions below the 1990 levels. So after that, we utilize a number of other tools, like our report tool and M-Plan. And we use these tools to understand the economic impacts of the policy scenario above and beyond what's happening in the baseline scenario. And through these tools, we're finding that by 2030, system costs are over $12 billion lower in the policy case than in the baseline case. And to Liz's question earlier, this does include the federal social cost of carbon. Over the entire study period, as I said earlier, we find a net present value of $26 billion, which actually doesn't include the social cost of carbon. There's also impacts in terms of jobs. For jobs, we find that the policy case has 94,000 more jobs by 2030, or about 60,000 more jobs every year compared to the baseline case. So, as I was saying at the start of this webinar, the RGGI opportunity provided a really interesting opportunity, to use the same word over again, to look at all of the different tools that we're using here at Synapse to examine multi-sector emission reductions. Our toolkit consists of a number of models that were created in-house, as well as a number of models that were created by others and then heavily customized by us. Our tools range from the free open source CAVT and energy efficiency savings tool, two spreadsheet-based tools that allow users to, number one, estimate costs of coal retrofits, and number two, look at energy efficiency savings potentials and costs. Other tools of ours include REEDS, which is an NREL-developed model that analyzes the complex electric system that we've made heavy changes to, and CP3T and M-SEM, two models that we've developed in-house that allow us to analyze emissions, both in terms of the Clean Power Plan and also in terms of state climate goals. Here's a list of the tools in our toolkit, just in a maybe a little bit easier to read format, and I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes going through each one of these 7 tools. So the first tool here is the Energy Efficiency Savings Tool. This is an EPA tool that was originally developed by Synapse for use by the EPA in the Clean Power Plan, and we've since adapted it and updated it in our Clean Power Plan Planning Tool, or CP3T. In the Energy Efficiency Savings Tool, users can specify an energy efficiency ramp rate, a savings level target, measure life distribution, and first-year cost of saved energy for each state. In the modified version of this tool that we have in CP3T, users can also add in a lot more information about historical data that's known, as well as sector-specific data. So we use this tool in the RGGI opportunity to take a look at what the energy efficiency standards for each of the RGGI states imply in terms of gigawatt-hour reductions in each year, both in the baseline and in the policy case. The Energy Efficiency Savings Tool is free and publicly available, both on the EPA's Clean Power Plan Technical Support Document website, but also as part of our CP3T model at cp3t.com. The second model that we customized is the Regional Energy Deployment System, or REEDS tool. This is an electric system capacity expansion dispatch model originally developed by NREL. REEDS looks at the lower 48 states and can forecast out data about generation and emission and costs based on inputs for load and resource costs. Synapse has made a lot of changes and revisions to the version of REEDS that NREL is using in-house. Our version of REEDS has a lot more information in terms of kind of the back end, in terms of being able to publish a lot more information about specific geographies, specific states, and specific regions. We've also made a lot of changes to the front end where we're now able to give it additional information about state-specific energy efficiency standards, which is really important in a analysis like the RGGI opportunity. The third model is M-Plan, M-Plan is a model developed by the M-Plan group, and it reports data on jobs and GDP based on information that the user gives it about costs. Synapse has overhauled M-Plan a lot. We've really focused on giving it or making it have greater resolution in terms of jobs and GDP impacts for coal, natural gas, wind, solar, energy efficiency, and other resource areas that are really interesting and really important to doing the types of studies like the RGGI opportunity. The version of M-Plan out of the box basically puts all of the electric sector under one bucket, and we find that that's not so helpful when you're trying to figure out the difference between coal and solar, for example. Moving into our in-house tools, the first one I'll talk about is the Clean Power Plan Planning Tool, or CP3T. And we've done a whole lot of webinars on this over the past couple of months, but for those who aren't familiar with it, CP3T is an Excel-based spreadsheet tool used for performing first-pass planning of statewide compliance with EPA's Clean Power Plan. So I alluded to this earlier. The Clean Power Plan is currently stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court, so there's a lot of uncertainty about planning and what the Clean Power Plan is going to mean specifically for individual states, despite the fact that there are states out there who are moving ahead with planning. And I'm mentioning this just because CP3T, we found, can be much more than just a clean power planning tool. It is a tool that allows us to look at unit-specific data and highly customizable inputs about renewables and energy efficiency to figure out exactly how states might look in future scenarios, or might look in the future under a given scenario. So yes, CP3T focuses on Clean Power Plan and gives a lot of really great detail about the Clean Power Plan specifically, but if you're thinking about state-specific analysis that requires unit-specific data, but you're also looking for a tool that's free and open source and transparent, then you might want to think about using CP3T, whether or not you're looking at Clean Power Plan compliance specifically. The next tool is our Coal Asset Valuation Tool, or CAVT. CAVT is an Excel-based spreadsheet tool that is used to estimate the cost of compliance with environmental regulations, specifically at coal units. CAVT takes together a lot of great information that's publicly available about specific units, so what units currently have for controls, how units operate, how much units are currently paying for their coal costs, and it figures out the future costs of operating these individual coal units and can compare them to alternatives like purchasing market power off the greater market, or wind, or natural gas, or other comparable alternatives. CAVT is also free and entirely open source and available on our website. And in the context of the RGGI opportunity, it was really helpful for us to understand exactly what the environmental retrofit costs might be in the future under both our baseline and our policy scenarios. Next up is the READS Post-Preliminary Reporting Tool, or REPORT, a clever acronym if I've ever seen one. REPORT is an in-house tool that we use to quickly synthesize outputs from READS and convert that information into data that's readable by CP3T, M-Plan, and M-SEM. So it's kind of a nexus of our tools that allows us to translate a lot of this different information between and across tools. One interesting thing that we've built into Report that we actually didn't use in the RGGI opportunity is a module that helps us assess future bill impacts of clean energy futures. So we've been doing a couple of webinars on this recently about the bill impacts of the Clean Power Plan. Report was an essential tool in that process in order to help us understand how bills might change as we shift towards a lower carbon future. The last tool I'm going to talk about is also our newest. This is the Multi-Sector Emissions Model, or M-SEM. M-SEM was an integral part of the RGGI opportunity analysis, and we developed it mostly because of the lack of transparent, inexpensive, multi-sector models that are out there that use publicly available data. So M-SEM takes that publicly available data and, together with shifts that are user-specified, figures out what energy and emissions might look like in the future for specific states, for specific sectors, and specific fuel types. So shifts that users can apply to M-SEM include things like electric energy efficiency, gas energy efficiency, heat pumps, electric vehicles, all of the same shifts that I was talking about earlier. As we saw with the RGGI opportunity, M-SEM can be a valuable tool for evaluating state and regional emissions planning, and can be really useful for enhancing findings from electric sector models. M-SEM can be used for engaging stakeholders on a variety of energy and environmental issues, and together with M-Plan can be really useful for projecting the job impacts of different clean energy futures. So that about sums it up for the RGGI opportunity and our toolkit. I'm going to turn it over to Liz right now, who's going to go through a few resources and other slides before we get into some more questions and answers.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for that great presentation. Just to remind everybody, if you have questions, please write them to me at webinar@synapse-energy.com, and I will pass them along to Pat. The slide that you see up now, it has a list of some related resources, some things that might be useful to you, including several different reports and other pieces of work that we've done using some of the tools that Pat was talking about. You'll also see down at the bottom here, the last link I think it is, a new blog piece and short report. I guess it's more of a slide deck than a report that that Pat has put together that is giving an electricity snapshot for 2016. It's got a lot of great information in there. Definitely worth checking out. That gives you a quick hit on what's been happening in renewables and in fossil fuels, and what the latest information is about progress towards a clean energy future. And here we also have a few links for you to let you know how to stay connected with us. This whole slide deck will be sent out to you and is also available up on our website, as is will be the recording. So I do have a few questions already that have come in. I'm going to start asking those and paying attention to new ones as they come in. First, before I jump into the questions, one thing that I've noticed about them so far is that we're going to have to distinguish between what we did in this RGGI project and what the models can do. That those are two different things. These are tools that we used for particular projects. So we may have made certain assumptions in the RGGI project. That doesn't mean those are the only assumptions that could be used for these tools, right? So we just want to kind of keep those two things clear a little bit as we're answering questions. So the first question I'm going to pass on to you is, we've had a couple questions now, actually, about asking about measures that we didn't include in the RGGI project. And there were quite a few. There are lots of different measures out there that can reduce emissions. Some of them are very important. Maybe if you talk just a little bit about the history, the report we did in January, the one we did, was it February or early March, that we've been adding measures on as we go. There's a lot more measures that we could still add on, but this was, the RGGI report is work that we did for environmental advocates that are interested in these issues and were looking for us to analyze a particular question.
Yeah, that's right. So I skipped back here to our curve that shows the marginal abatement costs for each measure. As Liz said, there's a lot of different strategies that you could look at here. You could look at offshore wind. You could look at greater use of electric trains for long-distance travel. Another area that would be interesting to look at is getting into the sector-specific costs of electric energy efficiency and gas energy efficiency, or maybe even deeper than that, looking at end use. So abatement potential and costs associated with lighting, say, versus HVAC. So there's a lot of different directions you can go here. For the purposes of this analysis, again, we're working on a bit of a limited timeline and limited scope. So the first time we took a crack at this, we only looked at electric sector and transportation sector measures. We sort of held the commercial, residential, and industrial sectors constant. And what that meant is that things like heat pumps and things like gas energy efficiency were not part of our initial analysis. And that meant that a greater degree of our emission reductions had to come from the transportation and electric sectors. One interesting thing of doing this project in sort of two phases was seeing the impact of what happens when you add new shifts to your analysis. What happens when you expand your analysis to other sectors, like the residential and commercial and industrial sectors. So in the version 2.0 that's now available on our website, you can see how we've expanded our marginal abatement cost curve to encompass these other measures and get a feel for how, if you were going towards sort of a broader portfolio of strategies, you can include other measures that aren't necessarily included on this chart right now. Another thing to note here is that for the purposes of this study, it was all about looking at the 40% target by 2030. There's no reason that the 40% has to be the be-all and end-all. You can imagine other studies and other analyses that look at, 50% or 60% or 80% or so on. And basically all that means is that this dotted line would move further out and greater emission reductions would be required from the resources that you see here or from the other resources that you're interested in looking at.
Exactly, and similarly, we didn't explicitly in the RGGI project model getting rid of any gas infrastructure that was already in place. One could do that using these tools. It just wasn't one of the measures that was chosen, so we left all gas infrastructure in place, and then there's a lot more generation from renewables, and there's a lot more energy efficiency, so it gets, in the case of the electric sector, it gets dispatched less, but is still available for reliability or what have you.
That's right. So in our analysis, we, with a few exceptions of more near-term retirements, we didn't explicitly remove anything from the analysis. So there's a whole bunch of retirements that are out there that are known, either because the resources owners have announced them or whether they've gone through capacity auctions and have officially delisted those resources. Those are encapsulated in this analysis. But as you get further out into the 2020s and especially towards 2030, there's a whole lot of information about what's going to happen to these resources that is really just unknown at this point. And in order to be conservative, we've left all of that infrastructure in place.
But on that same point, we haven't added new gas infrastructure, like pipelines.
So as far as pipeline goes, not explicitly. However, REEDS is a cost-based capacity expansion and dispatch model. So REEDS does what you tell it to a certain degree. It then operates within those constraints to build out a reliable system. So,
but in this case, it didn't build any new gas.
No, that's correct.
Right.
But there are some circumstances where we tell it to build a certain amount of wind that we think is economically available. But by the time you get out to 2030, the transmission constraints are a little bit different. Cost of these resources is a bit lower. And REEDS actually ends up building slightly more renewables than we specify is economically available in this first pass at the analysis.
Okay. Another question for you, and this is the right slide to be on for it. So in terms of thinking about the social cost of carbon, and you said that that is included when we're doing the marginal abatement cost analysis. And the purpose of this is to put all of these different resources that we studied in an order from least expensive to most expensive, and to say let's do each of these measures in that order and keep walking out the supply curve doing each measure until we have all of the emissions reductions that we need to get to our 40%. How would this supply curve change if we didn't include the social cost of carbon in it? And let me just say the meaning of that before you answer the question. So here, by including the social cost of carbon, we're saying carbon emissions in and of themselves have a price of value. And we're considering that here along with the money values and monetizing it, if you will. If we said instead, those values need to be considered separately, or even we don't believe in those values, you could take that out and still have a supply curve. How would that look?
Sure. So one thing that you want to note about this chart right away is that all of these resources have negative costs right now. They all have costs below $0 per short ton. So right now, all of these resources, if you're including the federal social cost of carbon, are economic compared to the baseline. Now, what I'm understanding Liz is asking is, what would happen to these dollar per short ton costs if you subtracted out the social cost of carbon? And we did a bit of a sensitivity on this analysis in our study, and we found that while the size of each one of these bars would shrink, they would all remain negative still, except for utility PV, which would be slightly above 0, but still kind of within the noise of things.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So it's not that the order of them would really change necessarily. It's more just that they would look slightly less favorable compared to 0, but they would still all be winners compared to the baseline.
They'd all still have benefits, but slightly smaller benefits.
That's right.
And they keep their order.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Next question, can you tell us what was assumed about nuclear generation in the RGGI analysis? So again, the difference between the two things, you could assume all sorts of things about nuclear analysis using these tools. But in the RGGI project, what was assumed? Sure. For the RGGI project, we're looking at a study period out through 2030. A lot of these states have goals that are actually based around 2050, and we've interpolated these goals to be in the 2030 year. And we're doing that basically because 2030 is kind of a more practical planning period for what we're talking about here. So what we're looking at is the time period between now and 2030. And in that time period, a lot of nuclear units still stick around. Our analysis assumes that nuclear units retire after 60 years. And for most of the nuclear units in the RGGI region, that just happens to be after 2030. That said, we did incorporate known unit retirements, like I was saying earlier. You got the nuclear unit that is retiring in Massachusetts and a separate nuclear unit that's retiring up in upstate New York. And both of those are incorporated in our analysis as short-term retirements. And the assumptions would be the same both in the baseline and in the policy case. That's right. Those nuclear units are retiring in both scenarios. We had a question about our jobs results for the RGGI report, asking about different kinds of jobs. And I peeked in the report, and it's true that we're not reporting it in this way, but indeed, as with most kinds of jobs analyses, there are direct jobs and indirect jobs, and then jobs that are then spread throughout the economy. And that is the methodology that we're using here, but we have, instead of breaking it down in that way in our results, it's broken down by categories. Oh, I'm not open to the right page here, sorry, Pat. Let me get to the right page for Pat, here you go. Sure, so I'm sorry, what was the question exactly? So the question is about, I think, what was our methodology for getting to jobs? Got it. And we're not able to translate this right now in the midst of the webinar into direct and indirect and so on, but that is the methodology that's used, but in fact, this is the kind of reporting maybe you could describe. Sure, that. So that's actually a really good question. So M-Plan is a really interesting tool. What it does is it looks at a number of different sectors across the entire economy, and I think there's something on the order of 500 of these different sectors. And depending on what you're spending money on, the tool figures out how many jobs come from one specific sector. So the sectors range from everything like steel making to glass making to more service-based sectors to really kind of random stuff. And what happens is, as we're saying we're spending some amount of money on some type of resource, let's say solar panels, for example, the model figures out how many of those jobs come from direct manufacturing and installation of the solar panels, how many come from indirect, so sort of the respending from those solar panels, to induced jobs, which are kind of jobs that are implied throughout the rest of the economy as a result of these new solar panels. Our analysis looked at biomass, natural gas, electric energy efficiency, solar and wind, nuclear hydro,
and a various set of other measures, of other resources, including transmission, transportation, and the non-electric sector measures like heat pumps and gas energy efficiency and oil delivery. So we're looking at a very large number of different resources. Sorry, I can't break them out for you right now. I don't have the numbers in front of me. But if you do have more questions, we'd be happy to follow up through email.
And this is in Appendix F of the report. I think there was a link to the report earlier. Is that right?
If there isn't, we'll send it out.
Yeah, I think when we send out the slides and the recording, we can also send or resend a link to our RGGI report to make sure that's in everybody's hands. But for a lot of these technical questions that are about what did we assume in the RGGI report, it's all laid out in detail in our appendices. So you can find a lot of the nitty-gritty in there that may be of interest to you. And then, of course, this is what's assumed here, but we're also presenting today about our tools, which could be used for a variety of different purposes and explore different kinds of assumptions. So.
That's right. So to expand on that a little bit, for this project, actually, we were able to spend a good amount of time researching new cost curves for things like heat pump and gas energy efficiency. So these are shifts or strategies that we hadn't previously looked at within M-Plan, and now we have the ability to look at these strategies, but we're always interested in going the extra mile and coming up with reliable, substantial job impact factors for other sectors and other strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a quick follow-up come in about nuclear, and then I'm going to go on to some other questions, but since we were on that just a moment ago. So the question again is about the assumption about retirement. So it's pointing out that there are a few other units that are going to be retiring more in 2029. I mean, we're doing 60 years from the point of operation, so I'm sure those were picked up as well. Right?
Sure.
It's just that's the very end of our modeling period. Right? So. Yeah, so
it's possible there is a unit that goes off in 2028 or 2029. Again, I can follow up more once I have the hard data in front of me. Mm-hmm. But on the whole, nuclear generation, with the exception of that Massachusetts and New York plant that retire in the next couple of years, nuclear generation is pretty flat in the study period that we're looking at.
Right up until the end, maybe. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So another question for you, and this I'll ask it of you, but also refer the questioner to our appendices, which give a lot of this detail. It's asking about how are we thinking about incentives and costs for EVs and heat pumps?
Sure. So that's a really good question. Now, when we're putting together this marginal abatement cost curve, what we're thinking about for resources that exist today but are not currently being used are what is the cost associated with implementing this measure above and beyond what is currently in place today. So something like electric vehicles have a cost associated with them that is the incentive around getting drivers to switch from using their electric cars, or switch from using their traditional internal combustion cars to using electric cars. So there is a positive cost associated with incentivizing people to switch towards electric vehicles. And you can see the exact assumptions that we've used there in our appendices. Heat pumps kind of works the same way. There's an incentive cost associated with getting people to switch away from their old oil heaters and replacing those with just new oil heaters to using heat pumps instead. What's interesting for heat pumps and electric vehicles is that there is an incentive cost associated with it, but these bars are still negative. And that's because users can see a surprising amount of savings just by not consuming the fuel that they were using in the reference case. So for heat pumps, where people in residential homes might have been spending a lot of money on oil between now and 2030, instead they're not. Instead they're spending slightly more on electricity and nothing on oil, or a much reduced amount on oil, just the amount of oil that they require for water heating. So there is an incentive cost that raises the price of these measures, but there's also savings to be had. And we're including all of that in our marginal abatement cost curve analysis.
Okay, thanks. And I do have a few more questions that people have sent in to ask you, but I'm going to interrupt and prompt you with a question of my own to get you to tell everybody my favorite fun fact from doing these reports, which is, so Pat, what happens to load, to the amount of electric demand, I should say, in the RGGI states when we both add in an amount of electric energy efficiency that is bringing all states up to Massachusetts levels of energy efficiency, within the next 10 years or so. And then we take a third of electric vehicles and we switch that use over into, we take a third of all light-duty vehicles and switch those into electrification. We take a big share of remaining oil heat and switch that over into electrification. Where does that leave us? Because I can say that before we had done this modeling and we were just figuring out how to do the project, we rather thought that the answer would be more use of electricity.
Yeah, this is, I would say, one of the more interesting facts that I learned from this analysis too is it just turns out that traditional internal combustion engine vehicles are just incredibly inefficient. They're just not very good at transferring units of energy into units of power to actually move a car. And we found that just with the assumptions that we're using here, 1/3 of all light-duty vehicle trips under 100 miles, switching by the year 2030, it really has a very small impact on the overall sales associated with the RGGI region. I'm thinking it's something on the order of, let's say we've got our 3% annual energy efficiency savings per year by the year 2030. The rebound effect, let's call it, from those electric vehicles isn't even half of what can be achieved through energy efficiency savings. Mm-hmm. So, and then the emission reductions that are associated with even that small 1/3 of electric vehicles that are traveling under 100 miles are really, really substantial. So we found that electric vehicles really is an incredibly cost-effective policy when you're thinking about policies that really get at achieving significant emission reductions. You can, as long as you're powering those electric vehicles with clean, zero-carbon energy, the amount of sales that come from them really just is dwarfed by the amount of energy efficiency savings that are possible.
And we found similar findings to that in reading other deep emission cut studies. Yeah. So, okay, a couple more questions that I've had come in. This is a question about adding new hydro lines. And the question is more methodological. It's what can these models do for us in that regard? What if we wanted to model a new transmission line bringing in Canadian hydropower? Can these models do that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a really interesting analysis to look at. You could think of taking the marginal abatement cost curve here and coming up with a reduction potential and a price associated with those new hydro lines and putting it in the curve wherever it goes, whether it's at the end, whether it's at the beginning, whether it's somewhere in the middle, and redoing the analysis and saying, let's get to 86 million short tons with that hydro line. You could also do something a little bit different and say, what if this hydro line is kind of a given? What is the new dotted line that you need to get to? That given hydro line gets us to, I don't know, I'll just make up a number here, you only need 50 million short tons. That will change things in terms of what gets selected in your marginal abatement cost curve. But just like offshore wind, just like distributed PV, new hydro lines is something that we can definitely bring into our toolkit, whether it's M-SEM or REEDS or the other models. And it's an area that is of interest to a lot of people these days. So it's something that we're definitely keeping at the front of our minds.
Mm-hmm. And some of the tricky bits about that is being able to predict the costs and the year when the transmission comes online because of all the uncertainty around those two variables.
Right. There's a lot of hydro transmission line proposals out there. They all have different online dates. Their online dates have changed through the years. Mm-hmm. So we can test those sensitivities in M-SEM and in our other models in our toolkit.
But there is some uncertainty, yeah. So I have a question again about the offshore wind. There's some offshore wind already planned for New England, and I'll begin to answer the question and say, yes, there is small amounts, but that would be in both the baseline and in our policy case. And what we're talking about these measures are things that are different between the two cases. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of gets to the heart of it, is that there are things that happen in the base case and there are things that happen in the policy case the same way. So another example might be the baseline levels of energy efficiency. There's baseline levels of energy efficiency happening in our reference case, just like there's the same levels of energy efficiency plus a little bit more that's happening in the policy case. So to translate that over to something like offshore wind, in our baseline case, we're building out what is known to happen in terms of those offshore wind developments, and our policy case keeps those in, but also does the assumptions that we've listed out here for onshore wind, utility PV, et cetera.
So once again, our baseline case includes everything that's already known as in policy or on a planning queue for the RGGI regions. That's in the baseline. Right,
so that includes offshore wind, but that also includes the changes to nuclear generation, to coal retirements, to known natural gas additions that we know about today.
And it includes all the RPSs.
That's right.
Okay. So a question about why and how we're putting in so much EV, so much electric vehicles for the region, and how that relates to the incentives. I'll start the answer again and say the amounts that we're looking here are potential. This is what's the potential for all these numbers. We're saying what's the potential, not what are there policies that exist to already make it happen. If there were already policies, it would be in the baseline, right?
Right. So what we've defined here is economically achievable potential. So what that means is that there is some potential for vehicle electrification, and if you look at all the vehicles, maybe that potential is actually 100%. But what we're talking about here is the potential that's economically achievable by the year 2030. So we've researched the numbers, we've analyzed them, and we've determined that getting to about 1/3 electric vehicles for those short trips, short to mid-range trips rather, by the year 2030 is a reasonable assumption. So that's what we're looking at in this analysis, but there are other analyses out there where you could say maybe this is too aggressive and certain states are politically unlikely to want to invest in incentives that get you to this level of electric vehicles. You could rerun this analysis looking at that other smaller electric vehicle strategy. And what that would imply is you would need to do greater emission reductions from the other shifts instead.
Right. And one last question, kind of cycling back to something we said a little while ago. So for the renewable potential, so first to be clear, for EV and heat pumps, part of what we're assuming is explicitly that new renewables would be added in order to cover that extra demand coming onto the system. And we're including those in the cost numbers. We're including that amount in the electric modeling, yes. Where are our assumptions about the region's potential for renewables coming from?
So those potential numbers come from a 2015 NREL study that looked at the same concept that I just described about economically achievable potential. That study has a bunch of different sensitivities saying what if these renewables are paid some capacity price, what if they're paid the full capacity price, what if they're paid no capacity price at all, what do those impacts have? What if you looked at things like different levels of siting availability? Those are all taken into account. And what we did is we dove into that study, we got the state-specific data for the assumptions that we felt lined up most with what we were looking at here. And if you're interested more in that study, we're happy to point you in the direction of it. It's cited in our appendices in our report, and there's a lot more information about the exact potentials that we use there.
So I think we're out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We are going to send out the slides and the recording and a link to the report, the RGGI reports as well. If you're interested to learn more about these tools or about this specific report, we're happy to talk to you. I'm going to go to the last slide again. and our emails are up here. You can get in touch with us from there or from the Synapse website. And thanks, Pat, for the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.